If you ignore this biological limit, you are effectively paying a 40% tax on your intelligence. There is a specific state of mind that measurably drops your IQ by 13 to 14 points. That is roughly the same cognitive impairment as going a full night without sleep. Most people assume that intelligence is a fixed spec, like the processor speed in a laptop. But the data shows that your functional intelligence, the actual processing power you have available to solve problems right now, is highly variable. It fluctuates based on the amount of available RAM in your brain. And the single biggest consumer of that RAM is scarcity. When you perceive that you do not have enough of something, money, time, or support, your brain initiates a background process that you cannot shut off. This process eats up your bandwidth, leaving you with less capacity to plan, regulate your emotions, or make good decisions. Today, we are going to look at the engineering behind the bandwidth tax. This analysis is based on the work of economist Sendhil Mullainathan and psychologist Eldar Shafir. Their framework suggests that being broke does not make you less intelligent. It means you are running your existing intelligence on a system with severely limited mental bandwidth. It is a hardware issue, not a software issue. We are going to break down the mechanics of how this happens, look at the specific experiments involving sugarcane farmers and shopping malls, and then engineer a protocol to fix it. If you are interested in optimizing the human machine rather than just motivating it, make sure you are subscribed to the feed. We treat the brain as a system to be managed, not a mystery to be accepted. Let us look at the specs. There is a prevailing narrative in our culture that poverty or financial struggle is the result of a mindset flaw. The argument usually goes that if people just made better long-term decisions, if they had more discipline, or if they stopped focusing on immediate gratification, they would not be in a scarcity trap. This view assumes that decision-making capability is a stable trait, that you are either a good decision-maker or a bad one. But from an engineering perspective, this is a fundamental error in attribution. It is like blaming a computer program for crashing when the CPU is overheating. The code might be perfect, but the hardware environment is hostile. The research we are examining today flips this causality. It suggests that the behaviors we associate with being poor, like borrowing at high interest rates or ignoring health issues, are not the cause of scarcity, but the result of it. The environment of scarcity degrades the processing quality of the brain. To understand this, we need to define what Mullainathan and Shafir call mental bandwidth. This is not a vague psychological term. It refers to two specific, measurable cognitive functions. The first is fluid intelligence. This is your ability to solve novel problems, detect patterns, and reason abstractly without relying on prior knowledge. It is the raw processing speed of your mind. The second is executive control. This is the management system. It handles impulse inhibition, attention switching, and working memory. Think of bandwidth as the available RAM in a computer. Every task you perform requires a certain amount of this RAM. If you are solving a math problem, you need RAM. If you are resisting the urge to eat a donut, you need RAM. If you are trying to listen to this narration while driving, you need RAM. The critical constraint here is that this resource is finite. You do not have unlimited slots for holding information, and crucially, bandwidth is fungible. The same resource used to calculate your rent is the same resource used to be patient with your children. Here is where the glitch occurs. When you have a scarcity of a vital resource, specifically money, your brain automatically prioritizes it above everything else. This is an evolutionary feature, not a bug. If you are starving, your brain focuses entirely on food. But in the modern economy, this focus manifests as a constant background process. Imagine opening a heavy program on your computer. Let's call it rent.exe. This program runs continuously in the background, constantly calculating sums, projecting deficits, and simulating disaster scenarios. Even when you are not actively looking at your bank account, rent.exe is allocating a significant percentage of your system's resources. The result is that every other application slows down. You might be physically present at work, but your processor is lagging because 30% of your cycles are dedicated to the background loop of financial survival. This is what we call the bandwidth tax. It is a reduction in functional capacity caused by the overhead of managing scarcity. You might think I am exaggerating the impact of this background noise. You might think, sure, I am a little distracted, but I can still function. But the data suggests that your self-assessment is wrong. The drop in cognitive performance we are talking about is not a minor dip. It is catastrophic. When researchers quantified this effect, they found that the difference in cognitive performance between a state of scarcity and a state of abundance was roughly equivalent to losing 13 IQ points. To put that in perspective, the difference between an average person and a gifted person is often around that margin. Or, looked at another way, it is the same cognitive hit you take from being awake for 24 hours straight. If you tried to operate heavy machinery in that state, you would be negligent. Yet, millions of people attempt to navigate complex financial systems in this exact cognitive condition. Let's look at the specific experiments that prove this, because the methodology eliminates the usual counter-arguments about education or nutrition. The first major study took place in a shopping mall in New Jersey. The researchers grabbed about 400 participants with varying income levels. They presented them with a hypothetical scenario. The participants were asked to imagine that their car had broken down. Half of the group was told the repair would cost $150, a manageable sum for most. The other half was told the repair would cost $1,500, a significant financial shock for many. While the participants were thinking about how they would solve this problem, they were given standard cognitive tests. They took Raven's matrices to measure fluid intelligence and Stroop tasks to measure executive control. This design is elegant because it isolates the variable of financial salience. Nothing about the participants changed, only the size of the hypothetical financial problem currently in their working memory. The results were stark. When the repair cost was low, both the low-income and high-income participants performed equally well on the cognitive tests. This is a critical data point. It proves that there was no inherent difference in intelligence between the two groups. The hardware was identical. However, when the repair cost was high, the high-income participants remained stable. The $1,500 cost was not a scarcity cue for them, so it didn't trigger the bandwidth tax. But for the low-income participants, the mere thought of a $1,500 expense triggered a massive drop in performance. Their scores on fluid intelligence and executive control plummeted. Remember, they didn't actually have to pay the money. They just had to simulate the problem. The simulation alone occupied so much cognitive RAM that they could not effectively solve the logic puzzles in front of them. The scarcity cue hijacked their processor. Critics might argue that a lab setting in a mall doesn't reflect real life. So the researchers went to India to study sugarcane farmers. This is a perfect natural experiment because these farmers operate on a harvest cycle. They are relatively poor right before the harvest, running out of cash, pawning items, stressing about bills. Then, immediately after the harvest, they are relatively wealthy. Debts are paid, cash is in hand. The researchers tested the exact same farmers before the harvest and after the harvest. This controls for every possible variable. It is the same brain, the same nutrition, the same education, the same personality. The only variable changing is the level of financial scarcity. The data showed that the same farmer was significantly smarter post-harvest than pre-harvest. Pre-harvest, their cognitive performance was suppressed. Post-harvest, their bandwidth was restored. They recovered those 13 IQ points simply because the background process of financial worry was terminated. It is important to understand exactly which systems are failing here. The study showed degradation in two specific areas. First, fluid intelligence errors increased. This means the ability to see logical connections and solve new problems deteriorated. If you are trying to figure out a complex bus route or understand a new loan agreement, you are using fluid intelligence. Second, executive control latencies increased. The Stroop test measures how well you can suppress an automatic reaction to do the correct, harder thing. When executive control fails, you lose impulse regulation. You become more likely to snap at your spouse, eat unhealthy food, or make an impulsive purchase. This explains why poverty is often correlated with what looks like bad behavior. It is not a moral failing. It is a depletion of the cognitive resource required to inhibit impulses. The hardware is running at max capacity, and the inhibition system is being throttled. This leads us to a counterintuitive conclusion. Usually, when someone is struggling financially, the advice is to try harder or pay more attention. But if we view this through the lens of bandwidth, that advice is technically unsound. The person is already paying maximum attention, but that attention is tunneled entirely on the immediate scarcity. Asking them to use more willpower is like asking a computer that is freezing up to run a high-definition video game. You are adding load to a system that is already thrashing. The solution cannot be to increase the demand on the processor. The solution must be to free up RAM. We need to look at how we can close the background processes. But before we get to the fix, we need to understand the mechanism of tunneling, because this is the trap that keeps people poor. Mullainathan and Shafir describe a phenomenon called tunneling. When a resource is scarce, your focus narrows to the immediate problem. If you need to pay rent by Friday, your vision tunnels onto Friday. This hyperfocus actually provides a temporary benefit, the focus dividend. You become very good at solving the immediate puzzle of getting that rent money. You might work extra hours, sell things, or juggle bills with precision. However, this tunnel vision comes at a massive cost, the tunneling tax. Anything outside the tunnel gets ignored. You neglect the oil change for your car because it's not in the tunnel. You ignore a nagging toothache because it's not in the tunnel. You miss a deadline for a job application because it's not in the tunnel. The problem is that these ignored items do not disappear. They grow in the background. The car engine seizes. The tooth requires a root canal. The job opportunity is lost. Inside the tunnel, the cognitive load is maintained by intrusive thoughts. These function like malware pop-ups. You are trying to work and a thought pops up. The electricity bill is due. You dismiss it. 10 seconds later. What if they cut the power? You dismiss it. This constant monitoring requires effortful control. Every time you push a worry out of your working memory, you burn energy. This is why decision fatigue sets in so quickly for people under financial strain. They are making hundreds of invisible micro-decisions every hour just to keep their anxiety in check. This depletion leaves them with zero reserve capacity for the evening. When they get home, they don't have the bandwidth to read a book or cook a healthy meal. They default to the path of least resistance, television and fast food, not because they prefer it, but because it requires zero cognitive load. This creates a feedback loop that reinforces the scarcity. Because the mind is tunneling on the immediate short-term deficit, it becomes blind to long-term costs. This is why payday loans exist. From outside the tunnel, borrowing money at 400% interest looks insane. But from inside the tunnel, the only goal is solve the problem of today. The high interest rate is outside the tunnel. It is a problem for future you. The bandwidth-taxed brain will rationally choose a disastrous long-term loan to solve an immediate short-term lack. This decision then creates a new scarcity in the future, which deepens the tunnel, which leads to more short-term decisions. It is a recursive error loop. The system is optimizing for the wrong time frame because it lacks the RAM to simulate the future. It is not a moral failure, it is a system failure caused by resource constraints. The researchers coined a term for this: scarcity salience induced cognitive inequality. That is a mouthful, but the concept is precise. It means that inequality is not just about who has more money, it is about who has more functional brain power available at any given moment. When scarcity is made salient, meaning when you are reminded of your financial problems, you are operating at a cognitive disadvantage compared to someone who is not triggered by those cues. This has profound implications for how we design our lives and our societies. A complex form to apply for student aid is a minor annoyance for a wealthy student. For a poor student, that same form is a heavy tax on an already overloaded system. The form itself acts as a barrier, filtering out the people who need the aid the most, simply because they do not have the spare bandwidth to navigate the bureaucracy. Most people try to push through this state. They think if they just wake up earlier or grind harder, they can brute force their way out of the tunnel. But the physics of the brain suggests this is the wrong move. Pushing harder on a maxed out processor just generates heat. It does not increase throughput. If you are in a state of scarcity, whether it is money or time, you cannot solve it by demanding more from your executive function. You have to solve it by changing the environment to require less of it. We need to look at what the researchers call freeing bandwidth. This is the protocol used by pros to reclaim their cognitive RAM. It involves moving decisions out of the volatile working memory and into stable, automated structures. The first step in the protocol is to abandon the idea of willpower. Willpower is just another name for executive control, and we have established that this resource is expensive and easily depleted. If your strategy for saving money or managing time relies on you making the right choice 20 times a day, your strategy is doomed. The goal is to design a system where the right choice happens automatically, without your input. We need to treat bandwidth as a scarce, valuable resource, just like gold. You should not spend it on recurring decisions. Every time you have to decide, should I buy this, or when should I pay this bill, you are burning bandwidth. The objective is to reduce the cognitive entry cost of your life. The most effective hardware patch is automation. Mullainathan and Shafir advocate for one-time decisions over repeated decisions. Setting up an automatic transfer to a savings account is a one-time decision. Once it is done, it requires zero bandwidth to maintain. Deciding to save money at the end of every month is a repeated decision. It requires 12 distinct acts of willpower a year. For someone with a bandwidth tax, those 12 acts are points of failure. By automating bills, savings, and debt payments, you are effectively closing the rent.exe background process. You are outsourcing the worry to a server script. Even if the amount is small, the cognitive relief is massive. You are buying back your own RAM. The same applies to time. Establishing rigid routines for meals and work blocks removes the need to decide, what do I do next? Structure is a bandwidth conservation strategy. The second component of the protocol is creating slack. In engineering, slack is the buffer capacity of a system. If a bridge is built to handle exactly 10 tons, and you drive a 10-ton truck over it, you have zero slack. Any anomaly causes a collapse. Scarcity is essentially a life with zero slack. Every dollar and every minute is accounted for. The problem with zero slack is that it makes the system fragile. A flat tire isn't just an inconvenience, it's a cascading failure that ruins the whole month. The goal of your financial engineering should not be to maximize consumption, but to maximize slack. This means building an emergency fund, not for the money itself, but for the cognitive peace it buys. Knowing you have a buffer stops the tunneling. It prevents the bandwidth tax from activating when a minor crisis hits. Slack allows you to remain intelligent during a crisis. Finally, we must design our personal environments for low bandwidth days. Assume that you will be tired, stressed, and stupid at 6 p.m. Design your environment for that version of you. Simplification is key. Reduce the number of accounts you have. Reduce the number of decisions you make in a day. If you are struggling with debt, consolidation isn't just a financial tool, it's a cognitive tool because it turns 5 deadlines into 1. The fewer variables you have to track, the more bandwidth you liberate for high-level thinking. This is why high-performing individuals often wear the same clothes or eat the same meals. They are minimizing decision fatigue. They are protecting their fluid intelligence for the things that actually matter. You need to audit your life for friction. Where are you leaking bandwidth? Plug those holes. Let's summarize the data. Being broke imposes a bandwidth tax that lowers your functional IQ by roughly 13 points. This is caused by the physiological mechanism of scarcity, which hijacks your attention and forces your brain to tunnel on immediate deficits. This tunneling leads to short-term decision-making, creating a feedback loop that deepens the scarcity. This is a hardware limitation, not a mindset flaw. The solution is not to use more willpower, but to optimize the system. We do this by automating decisions, building slack to absorb shocks, and simplifying our environment to conserve executive control. When you view your brain as a machine with finite specs, you stop blaming yourself for the crashes and start fixing the cooling system. If you want to continue optimizing your cognitive hardware, I need you to engage with the algorithm. Subscribing to this channel sends a signal that you want high-latency content, not just dopamine hits. Next week, we are going to look at the physics of attention span and why your focus is degrading. But for now, audit your background processes. Find the rent.exe that is slowing you down and automate it out of existence. Free up your RAM. I'll see you in the next one.